For those of you interested in being a part of the Mark study, but maybe you've missed out on some of the sessions so far, I wanted to just give you a brief kind of review of the material that we've looked at so far so that if you want to jump in, you can jump in, but you won't feel like you're completely, behind the eight ball. You're like on your game. So we're obviously basing this study on a book by Ched Myers, and Ched Myers is one of the amazing people who does not just take a theological look at Mark's gospel, but really tries to place the story of Mark's gospel, in its context. And that's one of the most key things about this study, is that we're trying to think about Mark not just as a story about Jesus, so that we can think about how amazing Jesus is, possibly even begin to elevate him as divine, but rather to see the story as a whole, and to think about gospel as not just about the gospel, the good news of Jesus, but how the message of Jesus, in a sense, finds its way into its context, into the story of the people of the time, into place, into person, into the social construct of the day. And really, to understand what gospel really means for our time, it's a super great way to look at a story like this, is to say, well, let's look at the story inside of what are often the silent voices that aren't actually part of the story itself, but part of the context that holds the story. It makes it a little bit more complicated, but it also helps, I think, give a kind of a rigorous depth to the way gospel works. So just a couple of features that I want you to know about. That's the first one. We will look at Mark's gospel and every story in the gospel, trying to unfold the context or the landscape or even the scenery or the stage on which the story takes place, and then seeing the story on stage in its context with the various players that you might be able to see because they're at the center of the action, or maybe they're not. That's number one. Number two, it's good to know that in Mark's gospel, what we've talked about is healing is about addressing collective dis-ease, not about fixing medical problems. And so whenever we look at stories of healing or even exorcism in Mark's gospel, we're asking ourselves the question, what kind of social issue is this really trying to address? You think about Jesus using terms in Mark's gospel about those who have eyes to see or ears to hear, let them hear. And then he's the one who talks about addressing people who are blind, who don't have capacity to see, or who are deaf, who don't have capacity to hear. He's really addressing not a physical ailment, but more ailment that's experienced by the culture or the people at the time. And even with exorcism is about naming that which has power over us, that has the power to rob us of our humanity. Calling out the demons is, in a sense, addressing those social ills. And so you start to immediately get a different feel of what is gospel really about anyway. Is it about trying to elevate one person, or to explore another way of being social together, to being connected to one another? That comes out clearly in Mark's gospel. The other one that happens over and over again that you need to be aware of is kind of the role of place. Jesus begins his ministry not in the central places that are normally used to debate or explore the religious themes or the economic themes, but it's always on the margins. Jesus starts in wilderness. People migrate to Jesus from places that are like central to society, but they migrate out into the margins to meet Jesus. That idea of playing with place happens a lot in Mark's gospel. Another perfect example that we're going to experience in this week's study is about crossing over from one shoreline over the sea to another shoreline. This idea of border crossing, or moving across the sea into uncharted territory. Very big in Mark's gospel, that idea of place. The other one that you find in Mark's Gospel that we've discussed so far is kind of not elevating Jesus up as if he becomes the most powerful one, but it's really about decentralization of power, distribution or distributing power, equitable sharing of power. You see that the way in which Jesus integrates women into his life, and Mark particularly into his narrative. A perfect example is the story of Jesus going to the mountaintop, much like Moses, but rather than going alone like Moses does, so that he becomes a special figure, Jesus invites his friends to go up to the mountaintop with him, in a sense to say, look, we're in this together. We have to figure out how to collectively live into this new way of life together. The other one that happens a lot in Mark's Gospel is Jesus refuses to be called the Son of God, but entitles himself the Son of Man, or the human one, as if to say we're really all in this together. Let's figure out a way forward that mirrors that reality. That shows up again and again in Mark's Gospel. And then the tension. There is a lot of tension that comes up immediately in Mark's Gospel that if you were in part of the earlier studies you would have caught on to. The tension between the dominant players of the day, the priests, the Levites, the Pharisees and Sadducees, and of course a Roman imperial power. That tension is thick in these texts, and oftentimes the demons are, in a sense, manifestations of those who are holding power. And so you get that very quickly in the Gospels about, when you name a demon, Jesus will sometimes use a name that infers that it's really someone who's not using their power appropriately. You see that over and over again. So that idea of a tension in the Gospels is always there in Mark's Gospel. That's one of the reasons why it's kind of an exciting Gospel to read. And then lastly, there is this kind of effort, and we're going to see this coming up now, in this grounding in a more gracious way of embracing an equitable kingdom. What Jesus refers to, or Mark refers to in this gospel as sort of jubilee, this idea of reallocating resources so all have place in society. Not just economic resources, but the way in which land is managed, the way in which relationship is managed, particularly in a very patriarchal and hierarchical society. Even the way gender is managed with the inclusivity of women. You see this over and over again in Mark's Gospel as this sort of a picture of a more equitable kingdom. In the next section that's coming up, if you're just jumping in this week, Jesus uses a parable to help imagine what that looks like, the parable of the sower. So that gives you a snapshot of where we've been so far. It helps you maybe get oriented if you want to jump into the Mark study and kind of feel like you've got some legs underneath you. Those are some of the themes that we're going to continue to watch unfold. I'll hope you join us on a Wednesday at 11:30 every week on Zoom, and you can find the link. I'll figure out a way to put it in this video, but there's the link on our website and on our calendar site. You can almost find it anywhere. But feel free to jump on board and spend 40 minutes with us as we continue to explore Mark's Gospel.